So grateful for my next guest, who has put forth a proposal on the housing crisis that has affected 23 million Americans. Just think about that for a second. 23 million Americans who are behind on their mortgage payments and their rents. His name is U.S. Senator Bob Menendez. He is a Democrat of New Jersey. He is a senior member on the Banking Committee. And Senator, I'm really grateful that you would come on here. Could you just explain to us what your piece of legislation would do that you have introduced with Chairman Sherrod Brown of Ohio, the chairman of the committee?
Well, the specific piece of legislation, Kevin, you're referring to is housing counseling. We have seen that every study in which individuals who are counseled in their housing needs and challenges ultimately find themselves being able to stay in their homes, to stay in their apartment, to achieve success, to overcome their financial challenges in terms of staying home, and to know the programs that they can access and how to deal with their lenders. When someone doesn't have that expertise, background, or assistance, then very often they find themselves either in foreclosure, out of their home, or out of their apartment. So we believe at a time, as you said, where there are at least 22 million individuals either who are at the verge of the potential loss of their home or their apartment, that housing counseling is a great way to meet their challenges, in addition to what we're doing in the Recovery Act that would provide direct assistance to homeowners and to renters in order to try to assure that during this period of time in the pandemic, where we tell people stay home when you're sick, and to the height of the pandemic we told people stay home so that you don't contract or spread the disease. Well, those who stayed home often didn't have the employment and the wherewithal to pay their mortgages, to pay their rents, and yet we were telling them to stay home because it was a way to stem the tide of the pandemic. So for all these reasons, we think that this housing counseling provision is incredibly important.
Well, I want to talk about the broader stimulus in a second, but just to follow up on this, it would provide $700 million for NeighborWorks to support housing counseling services. Senator, I was looking at the numbers. I mean, you look at the individuals who this affects, especially in this pandemic, and it's low-income and minority households that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and the economic fallout. If you pull the numbers from the Census Household Survey, just between January 20th and February 1st of this year alone, 14.1% of Hispanic households and 18.7% of black households were behind on their mortgage. You compare that with 7.2% of white Americans. Senator, it's just another data point that shows just how unfair this pandemic has been economically to minority communities.
Well, absolutely. Look, the pandemic has magnified the disparities in our society, the unfairness in many elements, particularly in the access to capital and to what for every American overwhelmingly is their single biggest source of developing wealth, which is their home. And so when you finally can break into being a responsible homeowner, and then comes a pandemic, and minority communities are faced with losses at virtually twice as much as their white counterparts. This is not only the loss of a home, which is where you nurture family, build communities, and build family, it's also where you build wealth. So when you're finally struggling to get that home, and because of no consequence of your own, you may very well be losing it, this is really an incredible blow to the development of economic well-being among minority communities, and it has been dramatized, unfortunately, by the pandemic.
So glad you're tackling this issue. I was just looking at data which says that the homelessness crisis is expected to peak in 2023. Of course, we're in 2021, and so I wonder, do you think that there is enough stimulus and enough funding in this bill to tackle what we expect is going to be a crisis in terms of the ability for homeowners, renters, and people who are homeless to pay for their living expenses as we reach out 2, sometimes 3 years into the future.
Well, I think that the American Recovery Act is incredibly important in terms of being able to stem the possibilities of those 2023 numbers pretty dramatically. If we get people to stay in their home, they're less likely to be homeless. If we get people to be able to remain in their apartments, they're less likely to be homeless. If we do that, and we do have monies for those who are already on the verge of homelessness or are in homeless situations, and start to stem that tide, we can dramatically change the course of events over the years ahead. And that's why this Recovery Act is, at the end of the day, there is a fierce urgency of now, because the longer we wait to get these resources to these American families to stay in their homes, to stay in their apartments, to avoid homelessness, the greater the chance that the numbers you just cited can be realized.
Senator, you're also, of course, the chairman of Foreign Relations, and we're very grateful that you come on this program and appreciative of that. But I have to ask you, as we're talking about economic stimulus, one of the themes that we talk about frequently on this program is China. And China, for example, has been using soft power and vaccine diplomacy all over the world. I'm curious, from your vantage point, Mr. Chairman, on the U.S.-China front, how crucial is it that this stimulus get passed, not just to bolster domestically the strength of the U.S. economy, but also to strengthen the U.S. footing geopolitically around the world against some of our adversaries?
Well, it's a great question. And look, first of all, we have to take care of our people at home. We have to vaccinate every single American who wishes to get a vaccine and should get a vaccine. And I'm glad to hear the President's announcements today of greater supply as a result of his efforts. We have to make sure that we recover economically. But the core of your question really goes to our greater China policy. And the developing of a policy that actually recognizes that, yes, we must confront China when it violates the international order, but we must also compete with China. So that means making investments here at home to strengthen not only our health, but our economy in the developing, cutting-edge technologies, artificial intelligence, computer chips, a whole host of being at the curve at the apex of intellect as well as innovation in order to compete with China. It means harnessing the powers of the collective economies of our allies, Canada, European Union, Australia, Japan, South Korea, by way of some. And when we come together, our collective economies are far stronger than China. Then we can be on a more competitive footing and challenge them for their unfair trade practices. And yes, we need to use soft power, and that includes the global health. And I'm glad to see there's $10 billion in this Recovery Act to deal with global health as a down payment towards that goal.
And just quickly, as a final question to you, sir, just how important is it that the U.S. supply chains domestically are able to sustain even and not be overly dependent upon China?
I think it's incredibly important. That's why I've advanced legislation to do just that. That's why I'm glad to see the executive order President Biden issue as it relates to supply chain. I never want to see a hospital in New Jersey or any place in the United States, a doctor at one of our clinics or any other place in the United States, not have the personally protective gear, not have access to the equipment and the medicines that they need, not have the ventilators that they need, never to be again in the dire circumstances we were at the height of the pandemic. So we have to recognize that, there are global challenges. Diseases know no boundaries at the end of the day. We can't hermetically seal ourselves off, but we can be ready for what the next challenge is, and that means having a domestic supply chain that can meet the challenge regardless of what it may be.